It began not with a scandal, but with a sentence sharp, almost surgical. You can tell a good director in about 5 minutes. Richard Widmark said, his voice dry and steady, as though diagnosing a sickness he had witnessed too many times. In that single remark lived the essence of a man who had spent half a century navigating the contradictions of Hollywood, a place that celebrated brilliance but forgave indiscipline, that crowned vanity while punishing humility. Widmark, the quiet craftsman from Minnesota, had spent his life fighting against that disease, the erosion of respect for the craft. To the public, he was the face of intensity. Tommy Udo's maniacal laugh and kiss of death, a sound that still echoes through cinema's memory. But behind that controlled madness was a man whose discipline bordered on spiritual devotion. He arrived on set early, memorized every line, treated technicians as equals, and believed acting was a sacred act, a covenant between truth and the story. And yet, as the years passed, that covenant was broken over and over again. He began to see something dark behind the glamour, actors who coasted on charm, directors who hid chaos behind genius, studios that rewarded arrogance. To Widmark, that was evil not in the biblical sense, but in the quiet, corroding way mediocrity poisons art. Near the end of his life, he finally spoke about it. There were, he said, a few men in Hollywood's golden age who embodied everything he despised: the cult of ego, laziness, manipulation. The names he uttered shocked those who heard them. They were legends, adored by millions. But for Widmark, they represented the death of integrity in a world built on illusion. It was not hatred he felt, but grief for a profession that had lost its honor, and for a brother who had lost his life in war, a wife who lost her memory to time, and a generation that lost its soul to fame. In the end, Richard Widmark's story was not about enemies, but about a man haunted by a single question. What happens to art when respect disappears, before Hollywood turned him into a symbol of menace? Richard Widmark was a boy with a fragile dream. Born in Sunrise, Minnesota, and raised between small towns and his father's bakery in Illinois. He grew up surrounded by movement, uncertainty, and the hum of ordinary life. There were no spotlights, no luxury cars, no rehearsed smiles, only the smell of bread, the laughter of his mother, and the sound of a projector in a small movie theater where his Scottish grandmother took him 2 or 3 times a week. That's where it began. In the darkness of those early theaters, watching cowboy star Tom Mix gallop across the screen, young Richard discovered something pure, the idea that film could be a form of truth. It wasn't the fame that fascinated him, but the focus, the way a scene could hold human emotion still, as if the world made sense for a few seconds. That belief would guide him for the rest of his life. In college, he studied law, then drifted into acting almost by accident. He was shy, intelligent, and serious, the kind of young man who didn't seem meant for performance. Yet when he met Jean Hazelwood, a fellow drama student, something changed. She shared his devotion to words, to structure, to honesty. Together they rehearsed lines late into the night, dreaming of New York, of theater, of stories that mattered. Their love was built not on Hollywood glamour, but on mutual discipline. When they married in 1942, Richard promised he would never let fame rewrite his character. "I happen to like my wife a lot," he later said, with his typical dry humor, but those few words captured a rare constancy in an industry addicted to novelty. For 55 years, he kept that promise. When the studios came calling, Widmark wasn't seduced by fortune, he was suspicious of it. He accepted the role of Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death only because it was filmed in New York, close to home. The character, a sadistic killer with a chilling laugh, would define his image forever. Viewers saw madness. Widmark saw craft. Every move, every inflection, every breath was calculated. His performance earned him an Academy Award, nomination, and a Golden Globe. But behind that success was something the audience never saw: exhaustion, self-doubt, and the fear that fame would consume the integrity he valued most. Hollywood adored his intensity. Yet Widmark quickly understood that the system cared more for profit than for precision. Directors demanded speed over depth. Studios scheduled films like factory shifts. Actors were praised for their beauty rather than their preparation. "I thought this acting thing was easy," he once joked. "I haven't won anything since." But beneath the humor, there was bitterness. By the late 1940s, Widmark had become one of the most respected names of his generation, starring in Yellow Sky, Roadhouse, and The Street with No Name. His reputation for discipline spread quickly. He was the actor who knew every line, who arrived on set before anyone else, who treated the lighting crew with the same respect as the director. He didn't flirt with co-stars, didn't party at premieres, didn't chase gossip columns. In an era defined by excess, Widmark was the quiet storm, a man who believed that restraint was a form of strength. Those who worked with him felt both admiration and unease. Sidney Poitier would later recall that Widmark was the first white actor in Hollywood to invite him to dinner. It was a simple act. Yet in the 1,950 seconds, it carried the weight of defiance. For Widmark, decency was non-negotiable. Every human deserved respect, on or off the set. And yet, that same moral code made him a misfit in a world that worshipped charm over conscience. On one side were the studios, hungry for charisma. On the other were the actors. Some brilliant, some careless, many lost in their own reflection. Widmark watched them come and go, the improvisers who refused to learn their lines, the stars who arrived late and called it genius, the self-proclaimed rebels who treated filmmaking as a playground. He despised none of them personally, but each encounter deepened his disillusionment. When people later asked him why he hated certain actors, he never answered with gossip. He spoke about behavior, not who they were, but how they treated the work. Acting isn't pretending. He told a young interviewer in the 1970 seconds, "It's a kind of listening. You owe that to the story." Behind that philosophy lay a private pain. His brother Donald, once the bright soul of the family, had survived a crash in Europe during World War II, only to return home paralyzed and haunted. For years, Richard cared for him, watching as the trauma slowly consumed him until his death in 1955. That loss hardened something inside him. Life, Widmark realized, was short and merciless. There was no excuse for wasting it on arrogance or indifference. The more he saw of Hollywood's machinery, the more he withdrew from its noise. While others collected trophies, he retreated to his ranch in the San Fernando Valley, working quietly, choosing roles for the story rather than the paycheck. He founded his own production company, not to chase profit, but to protect the integrity of his projects. Still, rumors persisted that he was difficult, judgmental, too serious. Perhaps he was. Perhaps the same qualities that made him great also made him lonely. But to those who truly knew him, he wasn't cold, only uncompromising. "You don't coast your way to greatness," he once muttered after watching a careless performance. By the 1960 seconds, when the old studio system began to crumble, Widmark had outlasted most of his contemporaries. He had no scandals, no addictions, no broken marriages. What he did have was a quiet sense of exile, a feeling that Hollywood had moved on, embracing chaos as art and confusion as authenticity. He belonged to another time, one where craft still mattered, where silence could say more than 100 lines. That contrast between his image as the on-screen villain and his reality as a moral purist is what made Richard Widmark so haunting. He wasn't just fighting other actors, he was fighting an entire culture of decay disguised as glamour. In the golden light of his later interviews, you can see it in his eyes, the mix of fatigue and clarity that only a lifetime of disappointment can bring. He had achieved everything the industry could offer, and yet he spoke not of fame, but of respect. The illusion of success had revealed itself as hollow. What remained was the truth that integrity, once lost, is almost impossible to recover. And for Widmark, that was the real tragedy of Hollywood's golden age, not the scandals, not the broken hearts, but the quiet death of discipline. There was a stillness to Richard Widmark that people often mistook for coldness. In reality, it was something else entirely, a kind of emotional discipline, forged not by ego but by survival. Behind every restrained smile, every precise gesture on screen, there lived a man who carried too many ghosts. His life had been marked by 2 wars, one fought overseas by his brother, and another fought within himself. When Donald returned home from the wreckage of Europe, his body was broken, but his spirit still tried to stand. For years, Richard watched him struggle against paralysis and pain, trying to reclaim a normal life that would never come back. Each time his brother fell, something inside Richard tightened. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. He had been spared the bombs, spared the blood, spared the burden. He had built a life of illusion while Donald had been crushed by reality. That quiet guilt followed him onto every set. Acting, for Widmark, became a strange kind of penance. Every role demanded honesty, because he felt he owed the truth to those who no longer had a voice. In his mind, the camera was not a tool for vanity, it was a mirror. And mirrors demanded sincerity. That's why he hated improvisation that led nowhere, or jokes that cut the tension of a serious scene. Every wasted take felt like disrespect. Not toward him, but toward the story, the invisible contract he believed bound all artists together. Colleagues who worked with him often described a paradox. Widmark was kind, polite, even tender in conversation. But the moment the camera rolled, he transformed. The temperature in the room changed. His focus became surgical. He spoke little between takes, preferring silence to small talk, to outsiders. It seemed obsessive. To him, it was devotion. And yet, devotion has a price. In the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, when Hollywood celebrated rebellion and charisma, Widmark's seriousness made him look like an artifact from another age. Younger actors were adopting the method, a new, messy, emotional approach that blurred the line between performance and chaos. Marlon Brando embodied it, as did James Dean and later Paul Newman. To the studios, it was exciting. To Widmark, it was dangerous. He respected Brando's talent, even admired it, but he couldn't stand the myth that art needed to be undisciplined to be alive. Some actors need chaos to create. He once said, "I prefer focus." Beneath that line, there was more than irritation, there was sorrow. He saw an entire generation confusing freedom with carelessness, mistaking impulse for inspiration. And then came Marilyn Monroe. When they worked together on Don't Bother to Knock, Widmark saw firsthand how the machinery of fame could devour a fragile soul. He described her later as a wounded bird delicate, luminous, but trapped in fear. The crew waited hours while she locked herself in her dressing room, trembling, doubting, spiraling. To some, it was unprofessional. To Widmark, It was unbearable compassion. He didn't see a diva. He saw a child lost inside her own dream. That experience changed him. It softened his anger toward incompetence and replaced it with melancholy. He began to understand that not everyone could bear the weight of truth the way he did. Some broke under it. Others escaped into vanity or addiction. Hollywood was full of both kinds. At home, his sanctuary was Jean. She was his anchor.com. Intelligent, unpretentious. She reminded him of everything that wasn't artificial. While others chased premieres, they stayed at their ranch, reading scripts at the kitchen table, tending the garden, raising their daughter. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness was sacred. For decades, Jean was the one place in his life untouched by performance. But in 1990, that sanctuary began to crumble. Jean was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The irony was brutal. The woman who had given him stability, who had remembered every line he ever rehearsed, was now losing her own memory piece by piece. Widmark abandoned film sets and public appearances to care for her. The man who had spent his career fighting for order now faced a chaos he could not control. He watched her fade in slow motion, a different kind of performance, one without audience or applause. It broke him in ways no critic or co-star ever could. Friends who visited during those years said he was gentler, quieter, and more fragile. He stopped talking about Hollywood. When pressed about the actors he hated, he simply waved a hand and said, "I don't hate anyone. I just miss decency." What he truly missed was meaning, the sense that the work had purpose beyond ego and profit. His own success had long ceased to thrill him. By the time he was awarded the D.W. Griffith Lifetime Achievement Award in 1990, he accepted it not as a triumph, but as a eulogy for a time, for an industry, for a generation that once believed in the sacredness of craft. Sidney Poitier, his friend of 40 years, presented the award. "For you, Dick, I would have walked," Poitier said softly, echoing the loyalty that few in Hollywood ever practiced. That moment, two men of integrity standing beneath the artificial lights, felt like the last flicker of something real in a world that had forgotten how to be genuine. Widmark spent his remaining years in near seclusion. The man once defined by control now lived in acceptance. Jean's death in 1997 left him hollow, but also strangely peaceful. He sold their ranch, moved to Connecticut, and rarely gave interviews. When he did, he spoke like a philosopher rather than a star. "Fame doesn't take your privacy," he said. "You give it away." It was then that people began to reinterpret his lifelong rigidity. Maybe it hadn't been arrogance or bitterness. Maybe it had been a form of love, a love for clarity, for structure, for truth. The same love that made him stay loyal to Jean until her final breath. The same love that made him furious when others treated art carelessly. He understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that the boundary between art and life is thin. Once you lie in your work, you start lying in your living. That was his greatest fear and his unspoken wound. The discipline that shaped him was also the armor that isolated him. He was admired, but rarely understood. In an industry obsessed with personality, Widmark remained an enigma, the moralist who played killers, the stoic who cared too much, the professional who couldn't forgive himself for other people's indifference. As age caught up with him, he began to speak about the idea of evil in gentler terms. It wasn't about villains or sinners anymore. It was about negligence, the kind of quiet evil that seeps into art when people stop caring. "The devil doesn't need chaos," he said once. "Just boredom." Perhaps that's what he had seen all along in the faces of the men he could never work with, not malice, but emptiness. the emptiness that grows when creation loses conscience. And so, in the quiet twilight of his life, surrounded by photographs, scripts, and silence, Richard Widmark finally made peace with his own contradictions. The anger had softened into reflection. The precision remained. But now it served only memory. He had spent his career chasing authenticity. But maybe authenticity had been chasing him all along, waiting for him to stop performing and simply be. The revelation came slowly, not through confession, but through time. In his last interviews, Richard Widmark no longer spoke about names. He spoke about types. To him, evil had never been a face. It was a habit, a series of small choices that eroded truth, one compromise at a time. When he looked back on Hollywood's golden age, he no longer saw glamour. He saw a gallery of archetypes, sick shadows that haunted every set, every studio, every decade. Each one wore a human mask. Each one reminded him of what he refused to become. The charmer on a clock was the first. He had met him many times, though perhaps most famously in Frank Sinatra. The charmer was the man everyone adored, magnetic, effortless, late. He floated through the day on reputation alone, turning charm into currency. To the world, he was irresistible. To Widmark, he was dangerous. Acting isn't about arrival times. He once muttered, "It's about arrival of truth." He didn't despise the charmer because of ego. He despised him because charm could excuse anything, even mediocrity. Then came the unbound genius embodied by Marlon Brando, the prodigy who turned rebellion into art. Widmark respected him, envied him even, but he couldn't forgive his indiscipline. Brando would show up unprepared, rewrite scenes, improvise lines, claim chaos as creativity. To Widmark, it was heresy. "You don't find truth by destroying the script," he said once. "You find it by surrendering to it." Their paths never crossed on screen. But in spirit, they stood at opposite ends of the same profession, one worshiping freedom, the other worshiping control. The mirror prince arrived next. Forever admiring his own reflection, Tony Curtis fit that pattern perfectly. Handsome, witty, perfectly groomed, but hollow inside. He treated film sets like runways, performing for cameras even when they weren't rolling. He spent more time fixing his hair than reading his lines. A crew member once recalled. Widmark saw it too, that obsession with surface, the need to be seen rather than understood. "He's not acting," Widmark said quietly once. "He's auditioning for the mirror." But Hollywood had room for all of them, especially the rebel drifter Robert Mitchum. Cool, lazy, indifferent. Mitchum bragged that he never rehearsed, never prepared, just showed up and hit his mark. The audience adored his effortlessness. Widmark loathed it. To him, that was the most dangerous lie of all, the myth that greatness required no effort. "You don't coast your way to greatness," he said, again and again, as though trying to remind himself that the world would not listen. And then there was the hurricane, loud, relentless, unstoppable Kirk Douglas. They had worked together, clashing like two storms in the same sky. Douglas needed to dominate every scene, to roar his way through dialogue, to conquer the frame. Widmark once refused a major role beside him, saying, "There's only room for one storm in a scene." And Kirk brings the whole hurricane. It wasn't jealousy, it was exhaustion. He admired Douglas' energy, but hated the noise it brought, the performance that never ended. Finally, came the one shadow that had no name, no face, no conscience, the machine. It wasn't an actor or a director. It was the studio system itself, the invisible engine that rewarded arrogance, punished humility, and turned art into product. The machine didn't need to be cruel, it simply needed to be indifferent. It devoured talent, manipulated headlines, demanded profit, and sold illusion as immortality. Widmark had spent his life fighting that ghost, trying to carve space for sincerity in a business built on spectacle. And in his later years, he realized something devastating, that the 6 archetypes weren't just people around him. They were fragments of himself. The charmer in his early fame, the genius in his perfectionism, the mirror prince in his pride when critics praised him, the drifter in his fatigue, the hurricane in his temper, the machine in his silence. He had fought them all, yet they lived inside him too. That was the biggest shock of all, that moral purity was never pure. It was simply another mask, another role. When he lost Jean, the line between discipline and loneliness blurred completely. For the first time, Widmark allowed himself to cry, not on screen, but in the quiet of his kitchen, staring at the table where they used to read scripts together. He realized that the anger he carried toward the undisciplined, the arrogant, the vain, was born not from hatred, but from fear, the fear of becoming irrelevant, of losing control, of being swallowed by chaos. His revelation was not about others. It was about himself. For decades, he had been the man who demanded respect for the craft. But in the end, he discovered that respect without compassion was just another form of pride. He had mistaken order for virtue and silence for strength. The very qualities that protected him from corruption had also isolated him from connection. In that sense, Widmark's true adversary was never Sinatra or Brando or Douglas. It was the mirror, the reflection of a man who demanded perfection in a world that only ever offered imperfection. By the time he spoke his last words to the press, his voice had softened. "I don't care how famous an actor is," he said. "He can live a normal life if he wants to." What he meant was simpler still. Integrity is a choice, not a gift, not a burden. Richard Widmark's greatest revelation was that decency, like art, must be practiced daily. It can't be performed. It must be lived. In the end, Richard Widmark's life resembled one of his own films, austere, deliberate, and quietly devastating. There were no explosive endings, no final applause, only the echo of footsteps leaving a set that would never be built again. When he retired to his house in Connecticut, the lights of Hollywood dimmed behind him, but something essential stayed lit: the small, steady flame of principle. He had spent a lifetime defending a vanishing code: respect for the story, respect for the audience, respect for the work itself. That, to him, was morality. Not the sanctimonious kind, but the simple decency of showing up prepared, of honoring your craft, of meaning every word you say. He never sought sainthood, only sincerity. Yet sincerity, he discovered, is a lonely road. The great irony of his career was that the man who played villains became one of the most principled souls in Hollywood. The darkness he portrayed on screen was never his own. It was the darkness he recognized in the system, in others, and sometimes painfully within himself. By naming it, by portraying it truthfully, he purified it. He turned corruption into confession, chaos into clarity. In his final years, as his body weakened and his voice grew softer, Widmark found what he had spent decades chasing: peace through imperfection. He stopped demanding precision from life and started forgiving its noise. When asked what he had learned after 70 years in film, he answered, "That decency is underrated." He wasn't talking about manners. He was talking about conscience, the rare courage to care in a business that rewards indifference. That was the moral he left behind. The invisible legacy running through every frame he ever touched. That art without respect is just noise. And fame without integrity is just emptiness. Perhaps that's why his performances still feel alive today. Beneath the villain's sneer or the cold stare lies a pulse, a man pleading with the audience to see the difference between pretending and believing. And as the curtain of time finally fell, the question he left us with still lingers. Quiet but relentless. What is the worth of talent? If it forgets to be human,